Hello, and thank you for attending our broadcast of considerations when moving to the cloud. My name is Sean Jens. I'm a senior solution architect with Ledgeview Partners. I have 11 years of CRM experience and 7 years of experience with Dynamics 365. All right, so let's start with some statistics. So today, Gartner estimates 75% of total IT budgets are used just to maintain and run existing systems and infrastructure. And according to Forbes, US-based organizations are budgeting $1.77 million for cloud spending in 2017 compared to $1.3 million for non-US-based organizations. And 70% of all organizations have at least one app in the cloud today. Some more statistics. The worldwide cloud computing market grew 21% to $110 billion in 2015, according to Synergy Research Group. And 17% of enterprises run over 1,000 VMs, virtual machines, in the public cloud, compared to 13% in 2015, according to RightScale's State of the Cloud survey. So, moving to the cloud is becoming more and more popular. So if you're, still hosting your CRM on-premise, you're starting to miss out. So why move to the cloud? Well, there's lower overhead in the cloud. Servers, they use electricity. There's hardware and software costs. You have staff costs. So you need staff or consultants to maintain those servers and that software. Updates, security is important. We've all learned that very recently. Enhancements, your users, want to get on the newest thing right now, and your IT staff has to schedule downtime to apply, both of these updates potentially to your CRM. And with the cloud, a lot of this stuff just sort of happens. Access, staff is more and more, wanting to access their data from, anywhere. They want to be at a Starbucks or, McDonald's and access their CRM data, or they want to, use their mobile device to look up contacts and schedule meetings. And the cloud just sort of enables that. There's no opening up ports and doing all sorts of, fancy configuration just to get access to your data. Support, your IT staff to support your CRM needs expertise in many applications. Dynamics 365 requires some knowledge of Active Directory and Active Directory Federation services. You need staff that know SQL Server, some staff that knows IaaS, that's Microsoft's web server, and the staff needs to actually know something about CRM itself. And then there's always the question of who do you call when there's a problem with your CRM. If your CRM is down, you need to go and round up a lot of staff members potentially to just to figure out what's going on, versus if there's an issue in the cloud, you just contact Microsoft in the case of Dynamics 365. All right, some considerations before you begin your move to the cloud. So during your initial evaluation, one thing to consider is there are licensing differences between the on-premise and online versions of Dynamics 365. The online version of Dynamics 365 has a per user per month model for its pricing versus the Cal true up version for on-premise. But Microsoft is actually encouraging companies to move to the cloud with recent licensing changes. So if you're on-premise and you have an on-premise version of Dynamics 365 today, you've probably noticed that your licensing has either gone up in cost recently or is soon to increase. Another consideration before you make this move to Dynamics 365 is just to find out if you already have an Office 365 subscription. This is pretty critical. Dynamics 365 is actually a component of Office 365. And you're really going to want to add your instance of Dynamics 365 to your existing Office 365 instance. You can move Dynamics 365 orgs from one tenant to another if you make a mistake, but it takes a lot of effort and work and, on your part to sort of schedule things with Microsoft. And it's just best to sort of know that right up front and make sure you add your tenant to the right tenant. And then another consideration with Office 365 is, are you already using cloud services from Microsoft? For instance, Azure. There are some benefits to having an Azure instance when doing a data migration from an on-premise version of Dynamics 365 to the cloud version. The cloud version of Dynamics 365 is actually hosted in an Azure data center, and you save on latency. So if you have like a lot of data to move, there can be some benefit to that. SharePoint Online and OneDrive, both of these products have integration with Dynamics 365, and when you're on an instance where you have the cloud versions of all three, the integration is just very easy, and it works very well. Exchange Online, so Dynamics 365, a lot of the newer features are using a technology called server-side sync, and online exchange to online CRM works very well with server-side sync. And then lastly, Power BI, that's Microsoft's business intelligence tool. There is some integration possibility between Dynamics 365 and Power BI, and that works very well when you have the cloud version. All right, so another consideration is storage space. So on-premise storage is kind of limited to whatever you have for hard drive and hardware space. Versus online, you get a initial quota of 5 gigabytes, and then an additional 2.5 gigabytes per professional or enterprise user licenses. You can buy more storage for a monthly fee, but it's good to kind of have an idea of how big your current database is, and an idea of what is actually making that database the size that it is. And we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But it is a very important consideration. Both the sandbox and production instances of Dynamics 365 in your tenant count towards your quota. And we'll talk about sandbox instances later when we get into development after you move online. But one thing you could consider is doing what is known as a minimal copy sandbox, where you essentially just copy the configuration data from your production into a sandbox copy, to save on storage space. What are the biggest users of storage in a CRM instance? Well, for Dynamics 365, there's three of these. There's attachments, which are both parts of emails and notes in Dynamics 365. If you have a whole bunch of attached PDFs, and they're potentially many megs, or even larger, in your notes or emails, say you've gotten in a practice of attaching invoices to every quote, you might want to consider moving these attachments to SharePoint or OneDrive to save on storage space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that during the data migration portion of this presentation. One consideration if you're moving to SharePoint is that the CRM user should be an admin in SharePoint. It helps do the configuration. The next big user of storage space is system jobs, and these are records that you might not really, as a user of CRM, be familiar with, but hopefully your CRM administrator is. these are actually sort of a record of a run of a workflow or asynchronous plugin. Oftentimes when you do the migration, you're triggering workflows, and if those workflows aren't set up to automatically delete their sort of record of their run, you can accumulate storage space very quickly. So one way to do this is you go into your workflows, and there's actually a setting you can set to automatically delete these system job records. Or another option, if you need to know if the job ran, is to set up a bulk delete to periodically clean out these system job records. And then lastly, the audit log in your Dynamics 365 org. It's recommended to turn off the audit log during a data migration if that is a possibility. And you're also going to want to sort of limit your what you're logging. So there's the ability to go through and actually say only log certain fields for certain entities. And that is definitely recommended because the audit log does count towards your storage space, and that can be eaten up very quickly. All right, so data migration. So now it's important to kind of get an idea of what you want to migrate, because by far the data migration is the thing from a consulting project point of view that typically takes up the most hours and is the most costly portion of moving from an on-premise instance to online. And then also there's considerations with data migration and storage space. Obviously, if you have a very large CRM database and aren't really wanting to pay for a lot of additional storage space when you move to Dynamics 365 online, you're going to want to figure out what you can migrate and what you can kind of leave behind. So some things to think about is you probably have inactive users. Should these users still own records that they may own? I mean, you may want that history, and that's potentially some additional logic that has to happen in the data migration. So there is additional cost likely with that, because you wouldn't normally set up an inactive user, in your 365 instance. Older records, can you exclude older activities? Maybe you only want to move 2 or 3 years of activity data. Some of that's going to probably depend on your industry and your situation. Obviously, if you've got some auditing considerations, you might not be able to delete old records from your CRM, but if you can, it definitely helps to exclude older records. The same thing goes for records that just haven't been touched in a long time. Do you really need a contact if you've never associated it with anything, and it's hasn't been maintained in 3 or 4 years? And then the last type is email and note attachments. Because they are one of the biggest users of storage space, it's always good to at least take a look at them and decide whether or not they're worth migrating, or if it would be better off to push them to a different system or just archive them altogether. Another consideration is personal views and charts. These are a little tricky to move, so they add additional hours to your data migration. But oftentimes users don't want to recreate these things, so they are possible to move. It's just something you're going to want to kind of figure out how prevalent they are and what you want to move. Since you're moving your data around anyway, another consideration is how clean is your current CRM database? Do you have a lot of duplicate contacts or accounts? Are there a lot of records that are kind of orphaned? Now is really probably a good time to clean up your data. This is obviously going to add some additional cost to your migration project, but it would definitely pay off in the end. Since you're moving to a newer CRM, essentially, it's good to sort of take a look, and since you're already planning it, this would be the time to schedule a dedupe and cleanup project. And then lastly, CRM keeps track of the last person to update and the last time our record has been updated. And if this happens regardless of how the record was modified. So during a data migration, one thing that often happens is we migrate a bunch of data, and then everything shows as being last changed on the date that the migration happens. And this can affect certain reports. It's not uncommon to have an activity report or some kind of monitoring type report that is based on a modified by and modified on records. So it is possible to preserve these. Again, it's very similar to personal views and charts. It's a little tricky, but it may be worth it depending on your situation. There's likely some additional cost in doing that, so it's just something to keep in mind. All right, along with the data migration, one of the choices you have to make is what kind of tools and where are you going to do this data migration. So if you have kind of a small database, something very simple, maybe you're only doing contact management, you might want to consider doing an import wizard to migrate your data. So CRM has a tool called the import wizard. It works with files, CSV or text files, and that is definitely an approach you could take to migrating your data, exporting out of your current instance and importing into the new instance with the import wizard is a possibility, but probably only recommended if you have a very small and simple data model. If you've got kind of a mid-sized database, which the vast majority of customers likely are in this boat, you're probably want to consider setting up jobs on some sort of local machine. So either the SQL server of your current CRM would be a good choice, or if you have an Azure instance, the Azure instance. You're probably not going to need to schedule anything. Our preferred tool for doing data migrations is integration services and a product called Kingswaysoft, and you can use those products sort of in interactive mode to do your migration, and that is definitely a valid setup for a mid-sized database. And then if you got a really large database, with millions of records and across multiple entities, you might want to consider actually scheduling jobs. And the reason for this is, you're not going to want to have somebody sitting and monitoring, in real time, because that migration is potentially going to take multiple days to complete. And, another possibility with a large database is you might want to sort of migrate some data over a longer period of time, and that's a valid setup. One thing with a larger database that you're going to want to do is there is some throttling for the Dynamics 365, specifically on execute multiple requests that are often used by migration tools. Both a tool like Scribe and Kingswaysoft use this method for migrating data. You can actually call support and bump up the number of threads that this message will use, and that'll actually help speed up your migration. So when you're setting up your jobs for moving data, one consideration that might help if you have large amounts of records, or you don't want to take as much downtime when you're doing the migration, is you might want to actually set your jobs up so that they do an update or an insert instead of just inserting records. And the reason for this is you can then run some records in over the course of multiple days, and then on the go live date, just sort of pick up changes since the last time you ran the job. And then lastly, a consideration, historical audit logs are one of these things that really can't be migrated. That's just a thing to note. If you care about your audit logs, unfortunately, they can't be moved to the cloud. All right, so now that we've talked about data, let's talk about customizations. So because you're essentially moving to a new CRM at this point, you're going to want to probably take a look at how you've customized your current CRM. Likely you're on an older version and you're looking at this point to kind of get to the latest. So maybe there are new features that fit your business process better. Also customizations, oftentimes they're more work to maintain. So this is a good point in time to decide whether or not you still need things that you've customized. Maybe you can leave behind some custom entities you created, and that will help you save on storage space, and it will potentially help you save on a migration task that you have to do. Another consideration for your CRM customizations are you might have had somebody, or you might yourself have done plugins or custom workflow activities, and these things, they're compiled code. So at this point in time, you will likely need the source code if you're going to want to try to evaluate these things, or you need to change them. And then lastly, the biggest question that comes up in any sort of move / upgrade, which is, are your customizations supported by the current version of Dynamics 365? Because oftentimes older versions of CRM, there was like a lot of code floating around on the internet for doing unsupported stuff. So it's easy to to have that in your org. So now's the time to look at it. All right, some additional stuff with existing customizations. Now is the time to find out if you're integrating with other systems. If you don't know, because you're moving to the cloud, your reports, if they're currently written in SQL, you're actually not allowed to write SQL-based reports in Dynamics 365 online. So you may have to rewrite these reports. Also, any sort of integration, say with your data warehouse or your ERP, you'll need to sort of potentially re-engineer these processes, because likely you're not going to expose your data warehouse or your ERP open to the internet. So if you're making direct connections to those databases from your CRM, you're really not going to be able to do that any longer. Another thing that's pretty common at this point is if you're reading data directly from the CRM database, you'll likely have to rewrite that integration as well. So just sort of figuring out what you're doing with integration is really important at this point. Knowing what tools you're currently using would be good, and if there are licensing issues now that you've changed from an on-premise situation to an online situation. And then lastly, are you staying on your current server? If you have your integration process running on your CRM SQL server, and the point of this move was to get rid of the SQL server, now your integration is going to need a new home. All right, so now's the time to make the move. So you've decided you're going to move to online. You've kind of done your pre-planning. Now you're at the point where you're right about ready to make the move. So planning is really important for a successful move to online. The first step is to kind of identify your stakeholders and what their roles are in your process. You need to have some people who are sort of accountable for various parts of this move. Make a checklist of tasks with their timeline. That's very helpful. Kind of knowing how this is going to go down will help you, have a successful move. There'll be less surprises. Communication, if nothing else, over communication is always very helpful, and users often appreciate being notified when things are happening during the migration, especially since this is kind of a shaky time for them. Letting users know when important checkpoints are occurring is really important up front. It helps get buy-in. If you've got to potentially take down your old CRM before you make the move, say because you got to do a data migration and you don't want people entering data in there while that is happening. Letting people know when they have to stop entering data in the old CRM and when the new CRM is available will help your users out. And then lastly, planning on doing the migration in particular when users are out of the system. Figure out a move window. Can you start at, do you have an after hours period, or are you a 24-hour company? If you're a 24-hour company, you might have to do like a phased migration or come up with some other technique for moving data. But if you're sort of a 9 to 5 and a 5 days a week kind of company, definitely consider doing the migration over a weekend. And just keep in mind your data migration can run a couple of days, and more than likely you're going to want to review that before everybody is back in the system. All right. Along with making the move, there's a lot of post go live considerations that you really should figure out before you get started. Training, likely if you're moving from an older version to a newer version of CRM, your users are going to need more training. So just figuring out the who, when, and how you're going to do that. Oftentimes, we like a train the trainer kind of method. So you train a bunch of trainers and then you kind of send them out to their various groups. Figuring out post cutover testing and validation. I mentioned this in the previous slide, but it's best to identify issues with data and CRM when there isn't everybody in the product. So planning for at least some time after you do the migration to validate everything came over and everything's ready before you have your whole sales force on there and you've taken out a whole room of support agents is definitely for the best. And then figuring out how you're going to handle any issues go live, after go live is really important at this point. Are you going to have a single point of contact? That would be our recommendation. How are you going to track issues and sort of know the status? Identifying a single person is often very helpful for that. It'll help make sure your project kind of moves along and things are resolved quickly. And then one last consideration, kind of really specific to Dynamics 365, is if you're using Outlook clients or configuring mobile users, oftentimes these products, if you're using the older versions of them, need to be upgraded, and that's not necessarily a thing you can automate. And depending on your version, newer versions of these products might not be compatible. So just sort of planning on when you're going to reconfigure Outlook clients or mobile apps, it's good to know that up front. All right, planning for post-migration. So after you've actually gone live and you're, in the cloud, there are some post-go-live considerations you need to think about. How are you going to go and do ongoing development? In your current org, hopefully you have some sort of development environment. Oftentimes, these will just be on the production server, but there'll be a separate copy of the database. For online, we recommend having a sandbox and figuring out a process for moving changes from your development sandbox to your production sandbox. How are you going to handle backups? You can actually do a manual backup of an online instance. We'll talk about that in a little bit. How are you going to handle upgrades? Here is again where the sandbox is really important. And although the cloud helps facilitate upgrades, having a plan for testing those and making sure your customizations stay working between newer versions, it's really good to know that before you make the move. And then if you've deduped your data as part of this process, how are you going to keep it clean going forward? Having a plan and procedure, so you don't recreate all the duplicate contacts you just removed is really good to know. All right, ongoing development. So I keep mentioning a sandbox instance. This is where you do your development and testing. You can have multiples of these. So you can have more than one sandbox instance. You get a free instance with 25 professional or enterprise license users. And consideration again is that the storage in this counts against your data quota for online. With the sandbox, it's really good to have a procedure for moving changes. We were from the sandbox to production. You can restore a production instance over top of a sandbox instance, but it's best to do your development in the sandbox. And then oftentimes we recommend creating solutions, which are just sort of a package of customizations, and then having a plan for moving that from your sandbox to your production instance. And along with just moving the changes, also knowing how you communicate with your users when you're going to make changes and move them from dev to prod. At this point, it's good if you don't have a procedure. Figuring that out right now is really good. All right, I mentioned backups. Online orgs are backed up daily. You can actually restore yourself the last 3 days of backups. If there's a problem, if you have a problem that you discover after those 3 days, you can request a backup be restored up to 90 days from Microsoft support. If you're making a large change, say you decided to do your deduping of your data after your go live, you can manually take a backup of your CRM instance, but again, it only lasts 3 days, and unfortunately, support can't get at these after those 3 days are up, so that's just a consideration. Upgrades. So now is a point to figure out how you're going to handle updates. Dynamics 365 is updated twice a year, this spring and a fall update typically. You can skip one update per Microsoft's update policy, but then the next one will be mandatory. The good news is that you can schedule when these updates happen, and we really recommend scheduling your sandbox first and then leaving some time for your users to get in and test that update with your customizations in the sandbox, and then fixing things in the sandbox before your production org is updated. All right. So I've probably scared a lot of you. There's a lot to moving from on-premise to online, but I want to kind of end this today with a motivating slide. You can do this. This process might seem overwhelming, but this ultimately boils down to all you have to do is 4 things to have a successful move to the cloud. Just a little bit of upfront research, so knowing size of your database and that kind of thing. Some stakeholder identification, so just knowing your point person, knowing who needs to know when things happen. A little bit of planning, and then a whole lot of, really is what it should say, a whole lot of over communication is really helpful for this. If you want some more resources on online licensing, or I mentioned Kingsway Soft as a data migration tool that we like. Here are some resources you can use. Also, a comparison of online to on-premises features are available. All right. Thank you for joining us today.